All right, deep divers, welcome back. We're diving into the 2024 election, and trust me, this is a deep dive. We're going way beyond the surface, past all those slogans and sound bites to get into the nitty-gritty. We're talking the economic platforms of Trump and Harris. And look, this isn't just about politics, right? This is about your wallet, your job, the future of the whole U.S. economy. You know those research papers that analyze every single detail of a candidate's plan? Yeah, that's where we're going. Let me tell you, it gets interesting.
It's fascinating. You really see the potential consequences, not just the campaign promises.
Exactly. One thing that jumped out at me right away was Trump's plan to lower corporate taxes. And I mean really lower them. We're talking rates that could rival some of those, countries known as tax havens.
Yeah, that's a key difference between these two candidates.
Ah.
Trump's approach is all about stimulating the economy through those tax cuts. The idea is if businesses have more money, they'll invest more, create jobs, and that boosts the economy. It's called supply-side economics. It's been a Republican cornerstone for decades.
So the idea is businesses thrive, everyone benefits. Like a rising tide lifts all boats.
That's the general idea. But of course, that has its critics. Some argue that these cuts mainly benefit the wealthy and corporations. They say it doesn't really trickle down to help average workers, and they point out that these large tax cuts can lead to a bigger national debt, and that can have negative consequences in the long run.
And speaking of debt, this research paints a pretty stark picture of what could happen under Trump's plan. Bloomberg predicts the U.S. national debt could hit a massive 116% of GDP by 2028 if he's reelected. I mean, to put that in perspective, that's higher than the debt levels we saw after World War II.
That's a huge number. It raises serious questions about the long-term sustainability of Trump's approach. A high national debt can limit the government's ability to invest in things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and it can lead to higher interest rates, which slows down economic growth and makes it more expensive for everyone to borrow money.
Okay, so we've got Trump aiming to, I guess you could say, turbocharge the economy with these tax cuts,
Yeah.
but potentially at the cost of a ballooning national debt. Now let's switch gears and talk about Kamala Harris and the Democrats. They're taking a different route altogether, aren't they?
Absolutely. Harris's economic plan focuses on using taxes to address income inequality and to fund those social programs like healthcare, education, and what we call the social safety net. Things like unemployment insurance, food assistance, housing subsidies, programs to protect people from hardship.
So instead of cutting taxes across the board, Harris wants to raise them on higher earners
Yeah.
and use that money for these social programs. It's a classic Democratic strategy, right? Create a more equitable society, provide support for those who need it most.
You got it. Harris argues this will create a more just and sustainable economy in the long run, investing in people, making sure everyone has a chance to succeed.
But wouldn't raising taxes on higher earners maybe stifle economic growth?
Wow.
I mean, wouldn't that discourage investment and job creation?
That's a common argument against tax increases, but it's a complicated issue. Some economists say that moderate tax increases on those higher earners can actually have a positive impact because it generates revenue that can be used for things that benefit everyone. Think infrastructure, education, research, and development.
Interesting. So it's not as simple as tax cuts good, tax increases bad.
Exactly. It all comes down to the specifics.
And even under Harris's plan, the national debt is projected to rise.
Right. It's estimated to reach 109% of GDP by 2028. So no matter who wins, we're likely looking at a future with significant national debt. The difference is how it's managed and who ultimately bears the burden.
Okay, so we've unpacked taxes and the national debt. Now let's look at how they actually plan to spend that government money. Trump's approach seems to align with those traditional Republican priorities. Strong military, limited role for government and social welfare.
Right. Trump has consistently pushed for increased defense spending. He says a strong military is essential for national security and projecting American power globally. He's also in favor of reducing the government's role in those social welfare programs, arguing they can create dependency and discourage work.
So under Trump, we could see a larger military budget and possibly cuts to programs like food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance.
It's a possibility, though the details of any cuts would depend on his administration's specific budget proposals. And those programs are politically contentious. Any attempts to cut them would likely face opposition from Democrats in Congress.
Right, that makes sense. Now, on the other side, we have Kamala Harris and the Democrats. They're all about investing in social programs and what they call human infrastructure. Things like education, healthcare, affordable housing.
Exactly. Harris argues that investing in these areas is key to creating a more just and equitable society. and making sure everyone has the opportunity to succeed. She sees these investments as both social and economic. They'll pay off in the long run by creating a more educated, healthy, and productive workforce.
So under Harris, we might see more funding for public schools, expanded access to affordable health care, more investment in affordable housing.
It's possible, but again, the details would depend on her administration's proposals and the negotiations in Congress.
Okay, so we have two very different visions for government spending here. Trump prioritizing defense and a limited role for government and social welfare. Harris focusing on investing in those social programs and human infrastructure. So for you listening, this really comes down to your priorities. Do you prioritize a strong military and lower taxes, even if it means potential cuts to social programs? Or do you believe the government should be more active in providing that safety net and investing in those programs, even if it might mean higher taxes?
Those are the core questions this election will answer. And it's not just abstract economic theories. These choices have real consequences for people's lives. They affect access to healthcare, the quality of education, the affordability of housing, ultimately, the kind of society we want to live in.
Well said. We've covered taxes, government spending. Now let's talk about something that's been all over the headlines lately. Trade. And specifically, Trump's trade policies, which have been, shall we say, a little disruptive.
Yeah, Trump's approach to trade has been different. He's been very critical of what he sees as unfair trade deals, deals that he says have hurt American workers and businesses. He's a big advocate for using tariffs, basically taxes on imported goods, to protect American industries and jobs.
Those tariffs have sparked some pretty heated trade wars, especially with China, right? I mean, 60% tariffs on some Chinese goods, that's a huge deal. That has to have consequences for both sides.
Oh, definitely. Those tariffs have had an impact. On one hand, they've raised prices for consumers and businesses here in the U.S., and they've disrupted supply chains for a lot of American companies that rely on those imported goods. But on the other hand, they've also put pressure on China to change some of its trade practices, and they've led to some small increases in domestic manufacturing here in the U.S.
So it's a bit of a mixed bag, some winners, some losers. But it's definitely shaken things up globally. And it's not just China. Trump has imposed tariffs on goods from other countries, too, including allies like Canada and the European Union.
Right. He argues those tariffs are needed to protect American industries from unfair competition, but they've also strained relationships with those key allies. And there are concerns about a potential trade war spiraling out of control.
Okay, so Trump's trade policy, a bit of a roller coaster. Now, let's see what Kamala Harris and the Democrats have to say. They're taking a different path, aren't they?
Yes, Harris has criticized Trump's tariffs. She says they're hurting American consumers and businesses more than helping. She favors a more cooperative approach, focusing on negotiating fair and balanced trade agreements that benefit everyone involved.
So instead of going it alone and opposing tariffs, she wants to work with allies to address those trade imbalances, create a more level playing field.
Exactly. Harris believes the U.S. is stronger when it works with its allies to promote free and fair trade. She also sees trade as a way to advance American values, things like democracy and human rights.
Interesting. So on trade, we've got that stark contrast. Trump's more protectionist, go-it-alone approach.
Yeah.
And Harris is more cooperative, multilateral approach.
Mm.
Now, let's move on to another key area where they have very different views.
Yeah.
Regulation.
This is where those fundamental differences in their economic philosophies really stand out. Trump believes excessive regulation is a drag on the economy, stifling innovation, preventing job creation. He wants to roll back a lot of the regulations put in place during the Obama administration, especially those related to the environment, finance, and healthcare.
So for Trump, it's about getting the government out of the way, letting the free market do its thing.
That's the idea. He argues that businesses can regulate themselves, and that the market's the best way to ensure efficiency and innovation.
But don't regulations serve a purpose? I mean, don't they protect consumers, workers, the environment from harmful practices?
That's the argument from those who support regulation. They point to examples like the 2008 financial crisis, which was partly caused by lax regulation of the financial industry, or the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, highlighting the need for stricter environmental regulations. They say regulations are essential for a level playing field, protecting public health and safety, preventing market failures.
Okay, so that's Trump's deregulatory approach. Now let's hear from Kamala Harris and the Democrats.
Yeah.
They're taking a different stance, right? They believe regulation is necessary to protect consumers, workers, and the environment.
Yes, Harris and the Democrats generally favor a more robust regulatory framework. They argue that regulations are needed to ensure fair competition, prevent monopolies, protect public health and safety, and address issues like climate change and income inequality. They see regulation as a tool to promote the public good and to make sure that the benefits of economic growth are shared by everyone, not just a select few.
So it's that classic debate, free market regulating itself versus government intervention.
Exactly. Where you stand often depends on your broader view of the government's role.
Big questions indeed. And speaking of big questions, there's one more we need to address. Immigration. It's a topic that's closely tied to the economy, and one where Trump and Harris have very different views.
You're right. Immigration is a complex issue with big economic and social implications. And as you might expect, the two candidates have very different approaches.
Let's start with Trump. He's taken a very hard line on immigration, both legal and illegal. He's implemented policies aimed at reducing both, arguing that immigrants take jobs from American workers and strain social services. He's also made it a lot harder for people seeking asylum to enter the U.S.
Right, and Trump's approach has been very controversial. Critics say it's inhumane, discriminatory, and harmful to the economy. They point out that immigrants play a vital role in the U.S. economy, filling jobs in many sectors, starting businesses, contributing to economic growth. They also say his policies have created a climate of fear and uncertainty for immigrant communities, making it harder for them to live and work here.
So, under Trump, we can probably expect continued efforts to restrict immigration and a focus on enforcement and border security.
It's likely. He's made it clear that he sees immigration as a threat to American jobs and security. He's unlikely to change course on this.
Okay, so that's Trump's perspective. Now let's look at Kamala Harris and the Democrats. They're taking a very different approach, right? They're more focused on creating a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants and reforming the system to make it more humane and efficient.
That's correct. Harris and the Democrats generally support comprehensive immigration reform. That includes a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who meet certain requirements. Things like paying taxes and passing a background check. They also want to reform the legal immigration system to make it easier for people to come here legally, especially those with skills and talents that are needed in the U.S. economy.
So under Harris, we might see a more welcoming approach to immigration, a focus on integration and creating opportunities for immigrants to contribute to American society.
It's a possibility. Harris sees immigration as a source of strength for the U.S., both economically and culturally. She believes that immigrants enrich American society and contribute to its dynamism and innovation.
Okay, so on immigration, we have that stark contrast again. Trump's restrictive, enforcement-focused approach, and Harris's more inclusive, reform-minded approach.
Exactly, and it's an issue with far-reaching consequences. It affects the lives of millions of immigrants, but also the future of the U.S. economy and society as a whole.
All right, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored the candidates' views on taxes, government spending, trade, regulation, and immigration. It's clear that we have two very different visions for the future of the American economy. But stay tuned because we're just getting started. In the next part, we'll delve deeper into how these policies could impact specific sectors of the economy, like healthcare, education, energy, and finance. We'll also explore how they could affect your everyday life, from the cost of your groceries to the availability of jobs in your community.
It's going to get really interesting. Welcome back. It's time to get specific. We've laid the groundwork, looked at those big economic ideas from Trump and Harris. Now let's see how they play out in sectors that hit a little closer to home.
Okay, let's get into it. Let's start with energy, something that affects everyone. I remember Trump being a big supporter of oil and gas, those more traditional sources.
Right. He often talks about American energy independence. He's criticized what he calls radical environmentalism. His administration rolled back a number of regulations, especially those impacting the energy sector.
So more drilling, pipelines, that sort of thing, and less emphasis on renewables, like solar and wind.
That's a likely outcome if his policies continue. He sees oil and gas as key drivers of economic growth and jobs. It's worth noting that he's been skeptical of climate change, even withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, that global effort to reduce emissions.
And on the other side, we have Harris, who's been pretty vocal about addressing climate change and transitioning to clean energy.
Absolutely. Harris and the Democrats are pushing for a rapid shift toward renewables like solar and wind, along with initiatives to boost energy efficiency and cut down on those carbon emissions. They see this as both an environmental necessity and an economic opportunity, creating jobs in a growing sector.
So two very different approaches to energy. Under Trump, maybe lower energy prices in the short term, but potentially at the cost of environmental damage and a slower shift to cleaner sources. And under Harris, a faster transition to clean energy, more focus on climate change, but maybe with higher energy costs initially as we make that transition.
Interesting trade-offs. Okay, what about healthcare? Another big one that's on everyone's mind.
Absolutely. And you guessed it, the candidates have very different views here too. Trump has been very critical of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. He's tried to repeal it multiple times, arguing it's too expensive and gives the government too much control over healthcare. He prefers a more market-based approach with less government involvement.
So if Trump wins, could we see more attempts to dismantle Obamacare? What would that mean for the millions of Americans who rely on it for health insurance? It's definitely possible. Without Obamacare, millions could lose their health insurance, and people with pre-existing conditions could face much higher premiums, making it harder to afford coverage. It's important to remember that healthcare is complex, no easy solutions. Any major changes would likely face big political and legal challenges.
Okay, a lot to think about there. Now let's talk about Kamala Harris and the Democrats. They're pushing for a very different approach to healthcare, aren't they? They want to expand access to affordable care. And they've even talked about Medicare for all, government-funded healthcare for everyone.
That's right. Harris has been a strong supporter of the Affordable Care Act. She wants to build on it, expand coverage, and lower costs. She's also spoken favorably about Medicare for all, though she hasn't fully endorsed a specific plan. The idea is that everyone would be covered by a single government-run health insurance program, similar to how Medicare works for seniors.
That sounds like a massive change. Wouldn't that be incredibly expensive? And how would it actually work?
Those are some of the big questions being debated right now. Proponents of Medicare for All say it would save money in the long run by cutting the administrative costs of private insurance and giving the government more power to negotiate drug prices. They argue it would provide universal coverage and eliminate the problem of people being uninsured or underinsured.
But wouldn't it also mean higher taxes to pay for it? And wouldn't it give the government a lot more control over healthcare decisions?
Those are some of the concerns raised by critics. They say it would be too expensive, lead to longer wait times for care, and reduce patient choice. It's a complex issue, no easy answers, and one that will likely be debated for years to come.
Okay, healthcare is definitely a hot-button issue. Very different visions for the future from the two candidates. Now, let's switch gears again and talk about education, another area that's vital for a strong economy.
Right. Trump has been a big advocate for school choice. The idea that parents should have more options for where to send their kids, including private schools and charter schools. He's also pushed for more vocational training and apprenticeships as alternatives to those traditional four-year college degrees.
So if Trump wins, could we see more policies to expand school choice? Like those vouchers that let parents use public funds to send their kids to private schools?
It's definitely possible. Trump and many Republicans believe that school choice gives power to parents and leads to better educational outcomes by creating competition. They say parents should be able to choose the school that best fits their child's needs, whether it's public, private, or charter.
But critics of school choice say it can actually make inequality worse. By taking resources away from public schools, especially in lower-income communities, they also worry it could lead to segregation and discrimination. If private schools can choose their students,
those are valid concerns. The school choice debate is complex and often heated. No easy answers there. It often comes down to your beliefs about the role of government in education and whether you think parents should have the final say in where their kids go to school.
Okay, so education, another area with very different approaches from the candidates. Now let's hear from Kamala Harris and the Democrats. They've been pushing for more funding for public education, especially in those lower-income communities, and they've talked about making college more affordable.
Right. Harris and the Democrats see education as a major driver of social and economic mobility. They believe everyone should have access to quality education, no matter their background or income. They argue that investing in public education is essential for a more just and equitable society, and for ensuring all Americans have a shot at success.
So, under Harris, more funding for public schools, more resources for teachers, maybe even things like universal pre-K or tuition-free college.
Those are some of the ideas being discussed, though the specifics would depend on her administration's budget and those negotiations in Congress. It's worth noting that education funding is often a contentious issue, both federally and at the state level. Any big changes would likely face political and logistical hurdles.
Okay, so education, another key issue to watch this election. Now, let's move on to a sector that's crucial for our economy, finance. This is where those differences in regulatory philosophy we talked about earlier really matter.
Absolutely. The financial sector is complex. Banks, investment firms, insurance companies, all these institutions play a vital role. And how they're regulated can have a huge impact on everything, from how easy it is to get a loan to the stability of the whole financial system.
And as we said before, Trump is all about deregulation, the idea that less government regulation will lead to economic growth and job creation. He's already rolled back some financial regulations from after the 2008 crisis, and he said he wants to do more if he's reelected.
Right. Trump and many Republicans think the financial industry was overregulated after 2008, and that those rules were holding back economic growth and lending. They believe the market can regulate itself and that the government should stay out of it as much as possible.
But don't those regulations have a purpose? Don't they help prevent another financial crisis and protect people from predatory lending?
That's what supporters of regulation argue. They point to the 2008 crisis, which was partly caused by lax regulation. It allowed risky lending and too much speculation. They say strong regulations are key to keeping the financial system stable, protecting consumers from fraud and inflows, and preventing another meltdown.
Okay, so that's the debate. Free market versus government intervention. Where do Kamala Harris and the Democrats stand on this? They've been more cautious about deregulation, haven't they?
Yes, Harris and the Democrats generally favor stronger financial regulations. They say the 2008 crisis showed why strong oversight is needed to prevent reckless behavior and protect consumers. They support things like stricter capital requirements for banks, more oversight of financial institutions, and consumer protection rules.
So under Harris, could we see a reversal of some of Trump's deregulation, maybe even new regulations to address emerging risks in the system?
It's possible. Harris has criticized Trump's deregulation, saying it puts the economy at risk and benefits Wall Street at the expense of Main Street. She said she'd prioritize financial stability and consumer protection if she's elected.
Okay, so finance, another sector with very different approaches.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to a sector that's often overlooked, housing.
You're right, it's often forgotten in these discussions. But housing is a basic need. It's crucial for our economy and society. But it's also an area where we face some serious challenges: rising housing costs, a shortage of affordable options, and ongoing discrimination.
And as we might expect, Trump and Harris have different ideas on how to fix this. Let's start with Trump. What's his approach to housing?
Trump's approach is largely about deregulation. He believes too many regulations, especially at the local level, are driving up costs and making it harder to build new housing. He's pushed for streamlining the permitting process, reducing zoning restrictions, and making it easier for developers to build.
So the idea is to increase the supply of housing to bring down prices.
That's the gist. Trump says a housing shortage is driving those high prices, and the best solution is to build more homes. He believes in the free market with minimal government interference to get this done.
But critics say deregulation alone won't fix it, and it could even make inequality worse. They worry it could lead to a lot of luxury housing being built, which would drive up prices even more and push out lower-income residents. They argue we need a more well-rounded approach, one that includes investing in affordable housing, stronger protections for renters, and policies to tackle that systemic discrimination in the market.
Those are valid points. The housing crisis is complex. There's no magic bullet. It will probably require a mix of solutions, both on the supply and demand side, and a commitment to addressing the root causes of inequality and discrimination.
Okay, that's Trump's take on housing. What about Kamala Harris and the Democrats? They're taking a more hands-on approach, right?
Yes, Harris and the Democrats see the need for both more housing A&D, more affordability. They support things like tax credits for developers who build affordable units, investments in public housing, and zoning reforms that encourage denser development.
So it's not just about building more houses, but making sure they're affordable for a wider range of people.
Exactly. Harris and the Democrats believe housing is a human right. Everyone deserves a safe, affordable place to live. They say the government needs to make sure that happens, and they're willing to use various policies to get there.
Okay, deep divers, we've covered a lot in this second part. We looked at how Trump and Harris's economic policies could impact all sorts of sectors: energy, healthcare, education, finance, and housing. As we've seen, these are two very different visions for the future of the American economy, with different consequences for different people.
Remember, these are just some of the key issues in this election. There are many other factors, things like foreign policy, social issues, and the candidates' personal qualities and leadership styles. But understanding their economic platforms is a crucial first step to making an informed decision.
Absolutely. And in our final part, we're going global. We'll explore how this election could impact America's role in the world and how it could influence everything from trade and climate change to international security and that balance of power. We've spent the last two parts really digging into the economic plans of Trump and Harris, how they could impact things here in the U.S. But the world is watching this election too, right? What happens here doesn't stay here.
Exactly. American economic policy has a huge impact globally.
Yeah.
It influences markets, relationships between countries. It can even shift the balance of power on the world stage.
Let's talk about those global ripples then. We touched on Trump's tariff wars, how they could disrupt trade, but zoom out a bit. His whole America First approach, what does that mean for the rest of the world?
Well, Trump's foreign policy has been, let's say, interesting. He's expressed skepticism about those big international organizations, pulled out of agreements like the Paris Climate Accord, and generally taken a more, I guess you could say, transactional approach to diplomacy.
So less about cooperating with other countries and more about making deals that directly benefit the U.S.
That's one way to look at it. This approach has definitely caused some tension, not just with rivals like China and Russia, but even with traditional allies in Europe and Canada.
Okay, so that's Trump's approach in a nutshell. What about Harris? Does she see America's role in the world differently?
Harris and the Democratic Party tend to favor a more collaborative approach to foreign policy. They emphasize diplomacy, working through those international institutions like the UN, and maintaining strong alliances, like NATO.
More of a team player then, working with others to tackle those big global challenges.
Yeah, you could say that. Harris has also been critical of how Trump's handled those key alliances. She says it's damaged America's reputation and made it harder to deal with things like climate change and terrorism.
Okay, so two different styles, two different approaches to global leadership. But how would these differences actually play out on the world stage?
Let's start with trade. We know Trump likes tariffs, using them aggressively to protect American businesses. But as we discussed, that's led to those trade wars, tensions with partners like China, the EU, Canada.
And if he's reelected, could we see even more of that? More trade disputes, higher prices for us here at home, maybe even a global slowdown.
It's definitely a possibility. When countries start putting up barriers to trade, it impacts the entire global economy. Supply chains get disrupted, costs go up, and in the end, nobody wins.
What about Harris? Would she be softer on trade?
Harris is more inclined toward free trade, those agreements that make it easier for goods to flow between countries. She's criticized Trump's tariffs, saying they hurt American businesses and consumers in the long run.
So under Harris, maybe a return to a more cooperative approach, negotiating trade deals that are fair to everyone involved.
That's a likely scenario. The Democratic Party generally believes that free trade, when done right, can benefit everyone. Lower prices, more jobs, stronger economies all around.
All right, so we've got trade. What about those really big global issues? Climate change, keeping the world safe. How do Trump and Harris differ there?
On climate change, the contrast is pretty stark. Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, rolled back environmental regulations. He's expressed doubts about the science and favored those traditional energy sources like oil and gas.
So if he's reelected, could we see more of the same? More reliance on fossil fuels, less focus on renewables, the U.S. taking a step back from global efforts to fight climate change.
It's definitely possible. Trump's position has been that he's putting American jobs and economic growth first, even if it means a different approach to the environment than many other countries.
Okay, what about Harris? How would she tackle climate change?
Harris and the Democrats see climate change as an urgent threat, something that needs action now. They're committed to rejoining the Paris Agreement, investing in renewables like solar and wind, basically transitioning the whole U.S. to cleaner energy.
So under Harris, a big shift in U.S. policy, more cooperation with other countries on climate change, a real push to reduce emissions.
It's very possible. She's made climate change a central issue in her campaign and pledged to make it a top priority if elected.
Big differences on climate then. What about international security? How would each candidate approach America's role in keeping the world safe?
Trump has leaned toward a more isolationist stance, questioning America's commitments to alliances like NATO, pulling troops out of places like Syria and Afghanistan. He's also criticized foreign aid, pushing allies to pay more for their own defense.
So if he wins, could we see America pulling back from global affairs? Less involvement in conflicts, more focus on things here at home?
It's likely. His America First approach suggests he's less interested in foreign conflicts and more focused on domestic issues.
All right, what about Harris? More active on the international security front.
Harris and the Democrats generally believe that America has a crucial role in keeping the world stable and safe. They support those strong alliances like NATO and are committed to working with allies to address threats like terrorism and nuclear proliferation.
So under Harris, maybe a return to a more traditional American foreign policy, more engagement in global affairs, working with allies to solve those big international problems.
That's a likely scenario. Harris has said America is stronger when it works with its allies and stands up for democratic values globally. She's pledged to restore America's leadership role and work toward a more peaceful and prosperous world.
Wow, we've really gone deep on this one, haven't we? From the U.S. economy to its impact on the whole world, it's clear this election is about so much more than just red versus blue.
Absolutely. These choices will have a huge impact, not just for Americans, but for everyone. The next few years will be shaped by the decisions made in this election. Everything from global trade to how we fight climate change, from maintaining peace to who holds global power.
So as you head to the polls or cast your ballot, think about the bigger picture. What kind of world do you want? One built on rivalry or cooperation? America going it alone or leading alongside its allies? The choice is yours, deep divers. Choose wisely.
And that wraps up our deep dive. We hope you found this exploration informative and thought-provoking. Remember, the future isn't set in stone, it's shaped by the choices we make today. So stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay curious.